Welcome to netnet.studio, an open source hypermedia cyberspace designed to help you unlock the web's creative potential. The web is one of the most dynamic and empowering creative mediums of our time. It's easy to lose sight of this if you've been stuck posting within the big tech platforms and their algorithmic feeds, but just beneath those platforms lies the internet's original hypermedia platform, the World Wide Web, the people's platform, capable of entirely new forms of media, many still waiting to be discovered. Despite the corporate layers accumulating on top, the web has remained open, decentralized, and collectively governed since its inception. As someone who values creative freedom, I love the web because it's both a shared public space and this infinitely malleable canvas. We could call it a metamedia commons. I'll explain what I mean. I say commons because beneath the big tech platforms that dominate our attention, the web is still a medium built by the people, for the people, collectively governed out in the open by member groups large and small, which anyone can take part in. This concept of the commons also hints at the fact that the web isn't just a tool, it's an environment. We don't just use the web, increasingly we live online. What matters more than any individual post is the cumulative effect of the medium itself. It's easy to get distracted by the content of any specific post, but the more consequential message here is the meta-medium, shaping how we think, feel, and relate to one another. To say that the web is a meta-media is to point out that it encompasses all already existing and not yet invented forms of media. Let me show you what I mean. As a visual medium, the web can include images from photos to logos. These can also be moving images, the kinds that already existed before the web, like this video of me talking to you right now. But the web also holds potential for newer kinds of moving images, like this generative animation I made from icons designed by the iconic Susan Kare.
If you're an artist and you're skilled with media, this is a new medium that offers great control. There's nothing really that you can't present on that screen.
Unlike this video clip from a Susan Kare interview, which will play back exactly the same each time you watch it, the animation behind me will play out differently each time you revisit this tutorial because it's being dynamically generated from code in real time. The code won't change, but the rendered animation it creates can, and it can run indefinitely. Videos have a finite duration, but the runtime on generative art can theoretically be forever. As a metamedia environment, the web is also full of data, and so the work that you make can directly pull, remix, react, and respond to that data. Take this experimental poem, for example. I did not write this poem in the traditional sense. I did, however, write the code which generated that poem. Like the conceptual artist Sol LeWitt once said, the idea becomes a machine that makes the art. And in this metamedia, our ideas are expressed in code, which instruct this machine, our computers, to render our art. The specific words of this poem are actually getting pulled and reassembled from recent news headlines, which, again, will be different when you rerun this tutorial tomorrow or the next day. The idea to remix news articles this way, like all great ideas, is itself a remix, in this case, of a formula for writing Dadaist poems by the Dada artist Tristan Tzara. The web isn't just a visual medium, it's also audible. It consists of the already invented media of recorded sound, like the sound of my speaking voice sitting in this room. But it also holds the potential for all sorts of new algorithmically synthesized and/or interactive musical forms. The music you're hearing right now isn't something I recorded. These sounds are being generated live from code I wrote running in your browser right now. It actually changes keys and tempo depending on the time of day you listen to it. And, like the visuals on this page, it's interactive. Just try moving your mouse around in the background, maybe even click to see what happens. And this is only the beginning. The possibilities here are endless. When Adele Goldberg and Alan Kay coined the term metamedia in the 1970s, they understood that computers would enable not yet invented forms of media, and they were right. In the decades since, we've seen video games, social media, augmented and virtual reality. These are new media born from the same digital revolution that we're still living through right now. There are countless not yet invented forms of media waiting to be discovered by someone creative and curious just like you. Whatever happens next in our digital world will be shaped by those who learn how to craft it. Of course, I'd be remiss not to mention that the web doesn't really feel as magical as it used to, even though technically speaking, it has more creative potential today than it ever has. And that's probably because the web is being increasingly colonized by the data barons of surveillance capitalism. That's the big tech platforms that I referenced earlier, whose business models revolve around harvesting our data and commodifying our attention with little regard for the consequences. As a result, they're slowly turning what was once an eclectic and diverse mix of personal pages and esoteric apps apps into this uninspired, homogeneous set of profiles with feeds full of endless spam and slop working to coerce us to shop, stream, and doom scroll for as long as possible. But it doesn't have to be this way. I mean, at least not like all of it. As I said earlier, the web is an open, decentralized digital commons. We each have the freedom to shape it, at the very least to craft our own little cozy corner, because no one single person, company, or country owns the web. Though many are certainly trying, at least at the time of this recording, the web still belongs to all of us who feel inspired enough to create and steward it together. You could spend your online life hanging out within the walled gardens of someone else's platform, but you can also grow your own digital garden. And if you're interested to learn how, and you're the kind of person that learns best by making, then you've come to the right place. This is what and who netnet.studio is for. The interactive tutorial you're experiencing right now is one of many different ways to learn in this here studio. The purpose of this first tutorial is to show you around the space and get you oriented and set on a path to reclaim the internet, and more specifically the web, as a medium for handcrafted self-expression and human connection on your own terms and conditions. Okay, so first thing I want to point out in this orientation are these windows, what we like to call widgets. The studio is full of widgets. I've opened up a few already, and there's more to come. You can move these widgets around by clicking down on the header of any of the widgets to grab it, and then drag it around to wherever you want. Most widgets are interactive, so I also encourage you to pause this video of me talking at any time if you want to click and explore some of the other videos, links, and interactive tools which pop up in the other widgets. You could also click around in the progress bar of this main video if you want to skip to an earlier or later part of this tutorial in order to reopen any of the previous widgets that I've since closed. You'll come to realize that almost everything you interact with within this web-based studio is a widget of one form or another, except for one very special window. If you haven't already met, allow me to introduce you to netnet. Netnet is more than just a friendly face, it's also the code editor that you'll be using, and the one that I use to write all the code behind the sounds and visuals that I demonstrated earlier. Whatever you or I write into netnet's editor immediately gets rendered into the web page in the background. But before we start writing any code, it's worth asking, what is code? For us, as creators of the web, code is the most fundamental material of our craft. It's language that we use to express our ideas and give instructions to our computers, which will in turn bring our ideas to life. In our case, this happens right here in the web browser. Code is central to what makes computers unique from all the tools, machines, and instruments that came before them. Unlike a car, which was built for the single purpose of moving us quickly through space, or a piano, which was created to produce 12-tone equal-tempered musical sounds, the computer doesn't come with one inherent purpose. The computer, and by extension the web browser, is like a blank canvas. Its purpose is dictated by those who write its code. Computers are programmable. That's what makes it a metamedium, or as computational pioneer Alan Turing put it in 1936, computers are universal machines. So we could attach wheels and motors to a computer and it can be programmed to drive you around like a car, or we could attach a speaker to a computer and it can be programmed to generate and perform elaborate pieces of music of any degree of complexity or extent, as Ada Lovelace put it almost 100 years before Turing. The creative potential of these universal, programmable, analytical machines is limited only by the imagination of those who write the instructions. These instructions can get incredibly detailed and complex, but they could also be very simple and pretty straightforward, like this. This is HTML, or Hypertext Markup Language, the web's most important and foundational coding language, and the first one you'll learn about here in the studio. There are other lessons that you can explore later where you'll learn all about HTML, starting from the absolute basics, but in this tutorial I want to discuss code a bit more broadly while also demonstrating how netnet generally works. So there are lots of great code editors out there, and netnet is intentionally designed to resemble a minimalist version of the most popular ones. So like those other code editors, it shows line numbers and uses colors to distinguish different parts of the code. But netnet's also a little different from those other editors, given its creative learning goals. For example, most professional code editors like these exist outside the browser as standalone apps. These days, the typical coding workflow involves writing some code in an editor and then switching over to your browser to view the results. This might also involve running some kind of server and sometimes also a code compiling or build step in between. If you want to go pro, you'll probably have to get used to some version of that eventually, but while you're learning, it's helpful to keep things simple and stay right here in the browser. Not that you ever really need to leave the browser. This is, after all, how the web originally worked. I'm going to avoid going down that historical tangent, but you can. I'll remind you again that you can pause this video at any time if you want to explore any of the widgets that pop up and pique your curiosity. Another differentiating feature worth mentioning is that netnet is also a real-time environment, which means that as soon as you type code in the editor, it gets rendered into the browser. Again, that's not a standard feature of most code editors and not really part of the normal workflow, but it's an important one for us because it enables more experimentation and unexpected serendipitous discoveries, which are important parts of the creative process, especially when you're first sketching and messing around with an idea. This also helps us catch mistakes as soon as they happen. For example, here's the code to create a graphical slider, what's also known as a range input element in HTML. Notice it right up here in the top left-hand corner of the page. If I were to misspell the word type here in the code, you'll notice something went wrong because the range slider has now turned into a text box, which is not what we had intended. Also, notice that netnet has added an orange dot next to the line number where I've made that typo. That's because netnet is programmed to catch common beginner mistakes, even if they're not immediately obvious to you. And it'll explain them to you in language that's both beginner-friendly and technically accurate. These error messages are netnet's best guesses as to what might be going wrong. And if you're not familiar with some of the lingo that netnet's using, that's okay. You'll learn more about concepts like elements and attributes in the intro to HTML lessons that'll come later. One of the things you'll eventually come to learn about in coding languages is that they each have a specific syntax, like these angled brackets you see on either side of the HTML code. They've also all got their own specific vocabulary. That's the colored keywords like input and type, what we call elements and attributes in HTML. I'm confident that you'll catch on to the overall logic and structure of HTML fairly quickly, but memorizing all the important keywords can definitely take a bit longer. Fortunately, netnet helps with this too. You can actually double-click on any keyword or piece of syntax in the editor, and netnet will do its best to explain what it is and link to further reading. This works for anything that you or I type into netnet, and even for code that you copy and paste from somewhere else. Try it yourself. For example, try double-clicking on the keyword input in the HTML code. When chatting with netnet, you can also click Tell Me More. That'll open up a documentation widget with deeper explanations and even deeper links for additional resources. These code explanations and friendly error messages are why we like to call netnet an AI TA. TA stands for Teaching Assistant, and AI is probably an acronym you're already familiar with, but I should clarify what sort of AI we're talking about when I say that. Netnet is not the kind of AI that required mountains of data and fields of GPUs to train. Netnet is classical AI. Its algorithms were handcrafted with love and care by myself and my collaborators. Netnet will never hallucinate when it speaks because everything it says was typed by a human being. It's not being synthesized in the moment by a large language model, which also means that netnet does not require massive amounts of energy to run because it's not running in some large faraway data center. It's running right here in this browser on your computer. That part's extra important because a prerequisite for true creative freedom online is privacy. That other kind of AI, algorithmic models based on artificial neural networks trained through a process known as machine learning, is something that netnet will dive deeper into with you in future lessons, so we'll leave that important topic aside for now. As for the topic of privacy, you can read all about that in our privacy policy, but I do want to briefly point out one part of that, which is that the work you create here in netnet Studio never leaves your browser unless you explicitly decide that it should. There are no user accounts on netnet, and that's intentional. We want you to get going quickly, and we don't want you feeling locked into this platform. While you can ask netnet to remember some things like your name and even connections to accounts you might have on other platforms, all that gets saved in your browser, and even then, only when you explicitly tell netnet to do so. Okay, let's write some code so that I can show you what this actually looks like in practice. Here's some code I wrote to draw a circle. This is written in a language called CSS, which stands for Cascading Style Sheets. Like HTML, it's one of the web's foundational languages. We typically use HTML to create the structure of a web page, and then we use CSS to change that page's style, things like layout, color, typography, but that's just the convention. Creative folks from the CSS art scene like to push this language to its absolute limits when making all sorts of elaborate compositions entirely out of pure CSS code. I'll dive much deeper into that whole scene and its creative coding techniques in later tutorials, where I'll begin again with this very simple shape. But for now, I'm showing you this circle as an example of what in netnet we like to call a sketch, a creative code experiment contained in a single file. Web pages can grow to include many files and media assets, but they always begin with a single file like this, and don't really have to get any more complex than that unless you need it to. Later, you'll learn much more about the basic CSS concepts, terminology, and techniques, which myself and netnet will cover throughout the structured lessons in this online studio. But it's also just as important to learn through unstructured play and experimentation. That's what sketching is all about. You might have never seen CSS code before, but I bet if you pause this video and take just a few minutes to experiment with this code, maybe changing some of the numbers or colors, you'll start to build an intuitive sense of how this all works. And then, if you end up making something you like, you can choose to save this sketch. As I said earlier, nothing you create on netnet leaves your browser unless you explicitly decide that it should. There is no autosave on netnet. The choice and responsibility to save something you create here is yours. What it means to save something here can get complex. In addition to single-page sketches like this, on netnet you can also create what we call a project, which is a folder with multiple code files and media assets hosted as a versioned Git repository, which you can also publish directly to the web. But here again, I'll let netnet explain all that in much more depth later when you get to that. For now, I want to keep our focus on a single file sketch like this, which you can save first by making sure your cursor is currently focused on the code. So just click anywhere in the editor first to make sure you're focused on that, and then press Ctrl+S on your keyboard or Command+S if you're on a Mac. netnet will let you either download the sketch directly to your computer as an HTML file or share it as a netnet URL. Choosing that option will compress all the code from your sketch directly into a shareable link. When sketching, you can think of netnet's editor as an infinite sticky note pad. Sharing a sketch is like peeling a note off the pad. You decide where it goes, whether that's sending it to a friend or posting it online. But if you lose that link, you lose the sketch. Same goes for the file if you choose to download your sketch that way. So store them somewhere safe. Okay, let's return to this idea of drawing a circle, this time using this vector graphics widget. If you're a digital creator and need to draw a perfect circle, chances are you've turned to vector graphics software before, something like Adobe Illustrator, Inkscape, Figma, etc. On the right side of this widget, you'll find a simplified version of the sort of GUI or graphical user interface that you typically see in apps like that. Go ahead and try interacting with the circle in this widget to change its position and size, and also try interacting with the toolbars above and below the circle to change the shapes and their details. As you use the GUI on the right side of the widget, pay attention to how the code on the left side changes. What you're seeing is the SVG code behind that rendered shape. SVG stands for Scalable Vector Graphics and is part of the same family of languages as HTML, which is why it shares some of the same syntax we saw earlier, like those angled brackets. This might be your first time looking at SVG code, but if you've ever used any vector-based design software, it's probably not the first time you've generated an SVG. Behind all the design software you've ever used, there's code. The code the developer wrote to build the app itself, but also the code produced by your interaction with that app, in this case, the SVG code. Most GUIs, or graphical interfaces, are designed to hide this code in order to make tools feel a bit easier or more accessible. But on netnet, when you encounter a GUI, it exists instead to augment or reveal code in a way that helps foster your understanding of it. This difference matters because when you create work only ever using apps with GUIs, the code you generate behind the scenes will always be limited to what that interface was designed to produce. You are creating within the imagination of the app's designers. But SVG itself can do far more than what most vector graphics apps expose. It can be animated, made interactive, and responsive to sound or other data. These are possibilities you might never discover if there were no buttons or knobs for them in the app's interface. Bringing the SVG directly into the editor opens up this space of possibilities. For example, here I've added just a little bit of SVG code so that the shape we created in the widget is now animated. Central to code's power and beauty is its malleability. Any digital idea you have can be molded into code, and like any language, code offers countless different ways of expressing that same idea. Remember this CSS circle from earlier? This is only one way to tell the computer to draw a circle with CSS. We could also tell the computer to write a circle this way. Or we can scrap our CSS code entirely and tell the computer to draw a circle using a different language like we did a moment ago with SVG. The SVG circle element we used here is the most common way to create a circle using this language, but we could also tell the computer to draw a circle in SVG code this way. We could also tell the computer to draw a circle this way, or this way. These last couple sketches I wrote in JavaScript, the web's de facto programming language. When you want to make your HTML, SVG, and CSS code even more dynamic than it is by default, you can use JavaScript to add all manner of interactive and generative dimensions to your work. A classic creative coding starter sketch is to tell the computer to draw circles every time the mouse moves, like this. Just try moving your mouse around behind me to see that in action. There are even more ways we could tell the computer to draw a circle. This idea is beautifully illustrated in a piece called Draw a Circle by artist and creative technologist Yuki Yoshida, where he documents many more ways to tell the computer to draw this very simple shape. Now, all that said, by no means am I implying that you shouldn't use creative software with graphical user interfaces. If you need your computer to do something fairly conventional or very specific, like resize an image or cut two pieces of video together or apply reverb to an audio recording or even create an SVG icon of a simple circle, it's often much faster and easier to use existing tools than to build your own solution in code, assuming you've already got some app installed for that and you're comfortable using it. Not all creative ideas require pushing the bounds of this metamedium through handcrafted code. Besides sharing my excitement for the infinitely expressive potential of code, the larger point I'm trying to make here is that it's crucial to understand how the tools we use shape the ideas we have. This is especially true on the internet, where many platforms claiming to support self-expression really only care about and are optimized for one thing: engagement. And this shapes the way that we make and what we value in ways that don't always serve our creative intentions. The danger of these platforms is not the threat that they may wind up archiving and owning all the content I produce, though that is a concern, or that they are currently getting rich off the content I produce, though that's also frustrating. The real danger is that they control the parameters within which I produce my original content. Even tools that aren't trying to maliciously exploit us might still unintentionally limit our creative ideas in subtle but consequential ways. Let me give you one last example of this. Here's an image with a color saturation slider like you'd find in a raster image editing software like GIMP or Photoshop. Go ahead and actually try the slider out. When it's in the center, the image appears normal and unedited. If you move it to the left, the colors gradually fade until it becomes grayscale or black and white. If you move it to the right, the colors become increasingly saturated, eventually looking exaggerated and intense. But could we make it more intense? Well, not by using the slider as is, but if we take a look at the code behind it, endless possibilities abound. Even tiny edits can have a big impact on the aesthetics of the sketch. For example, notice that the input range, the HTML element that creates the slider, has its max value set to 2. Go ahead and try changing that number to 20 or 200 or even 2000, and then adjust the slider again so you can see what happens. This tiny edit has a pretty big impact on the aesthetics of the sketch, and it might even inspire new ideas and where you might want to take this sketch next. At the very least, I hope it shows that many of the boundaries you may have unconsciously internalized in creative software aren't inherent to the computer at all, but the result of someone else's design decisions and imagination. In code, you're limited only by your own imagination, and to some extent your fluency in this craft, but you don't need to be an expert to start taking advantage of this creative freedom. Sometimes all it takes is changing a single value, looking directly at the code that shapes our digital environment, and experimenting with small adjustments open up entirely new possibilities, not just for what we make, but also for how we think about what we can get our computers to do, the ideas that we come up with. The key word here is literacy. Becoming really fluent and proficient in any coding language, not to mention in more than one, can take some time. But becoming literate starts immediately, and this literacy grants you tremendous agency. As with any language, simply learning to read and write does not make you a historian or a poet of that language, but literacy does give you a voice in the world and a way to understand and navigate it. Learning to code from this vector view accomplishes the same in the digital world. It sharpens your ability to question the systems you inhabit, to advocate for yourself within them, and to imagine more freely, so that even if you never decide to code anything on your own, if and when you collaborate on code with other intelligences, human or otherwise, those collaborations will be guided by a deeper understanding of the medium rather than limited by the default settings and surface interfaces of the status quo. Helping you build a strong foundational literacy, that deeper understanding of the web as a creative metamedia commons, and the agency to reclaim it for yourself, that's why netnet.studio exists. And as I mentioned earlier, we've got loads of interactive lessons to get you started. These can all be found in the Learning Guide, which you can open up at any time by clicking on NetNet's face. If you haven't done that yet, you should try that out. You can actually click on NetNet's face at any time to open up the main menu, and there you'll find 4 options. First is the option to say hi to NetNet. This launches that same initial conversation that you get when you first load Netnet Studio. Second is the coding menu, which I'll come back to in a minute. Third is the search bar, which you can use to find any widget, tutorial, or example that you maybe came across before but forgot where to find it. And lastly, the fourth option in the main menu is this learning guide. You could absolutely go through the material in this widget in order, like from top to bottom, but keep in mind that this studio, like the web itself, is hypermedia. It's interactive and can be explored non-linearly, like a choose-your-own adventure. You'll also find different types of lessons in this widget. This interactive tutorial you're experiencing right now is just one of them. Let's say, for example, this isn't your first rodeo and you've done a little HTML and CSS before, and you're here to try to experiment with some of the new creative possibilities. You could instead start by checking out some of the demos. On netnet, a demo is a single file sketch which demonstrates an isolated creative concept which netnet can explain and you can remix. If you're brand new to code, you might instead start by launching one of netnet's guided introductions to a particular language or concept. You'll find all the different languages listed in this learning guide, and for each coding language, you'll also find documentation if you're looking to review or read any of the foundational ideas. You'll also find project templates, which can be used as starting points for new work or as interactive lessons themselves, with netnet guiding you through the template, building it out line by line, and explaining core concepts along the way. And remember what I said earlier in this orientation. In addition to your preferred mode of structured learning, netnet.studio is also a place for unstructured experimentation. That could mean remixing a demo, building on a project template, or even just starting with a blank canvas, which you could always ask netnet for, or you could navigate directly to by visiting netnet.studio/sketch. But before you start sketching and experimenting in the editor, you should take a minute to explore the coding menu that I mentioned earlier, which you can open from that main menu you get when you click on netnet's face. There you can find helpful functions related to your code, as well as editor settings you can modify to customize the studio to your liking. Typical code editor settings like adjusting the color theme and layout, as well as netnet specific things like adjusting netnet's chattiness level. Although, here it's worth pointing out that even though you can adjust how much netnet talks to you, chatting with netnet is still the main way that you'll navigate and learn in the studio. I don't know, it might feel like a lot to read at first, but we've done our best to write things as concise as possible. And the reality is that learning to code here or anywhere means reading a lot. That could be error messages, documentation, forum posts, reading other people's code, and increasingly also AI-generated code and explanations. Coding is fundamentally a practice of reading and writing, and netnet is also here to help you ease into that aspect of it as well. Okay, so this is probably a good place to end this orientation, but there's loads more to discover and experiment with here on netnet.studio. Don't forget that you can jump around to earlier parts of this interactive tutorial using the progress bar in this video. I also want to mention that you can visit netnet.studio/docs to learn even more about this whole project. But before you start exploring and experimenting, I want to end this tutorial by reminding us why we're here. The modern internet can feel pretty upsetting at times, but that has less to do with the internet itself and more to do with the parts we've chosen to spend our time in, the corporate platforms that dominate the web these days. Now, I'm not here to shame anyone for joining these platforms. I totally get that they've made sharing and consuming content online a little more convenient than writing our own HTML code, but I'm probably not the first to tell you that this convenience comes at a cost. When we trade the open web for these walled gardens, we're also trading away our creative freedom, our ability to define who we are and how we choose to engage with others online. And it's exactly this desire to share and connect that big tech has exploited to keep us locked into their platforms. Good news is you don't have to surrender your heart and mind to the data barons. You can reject the uninspired conventions of homogeneous profiles designed to harvest your data and commodify your attention, and instead create your own home pages, your own little corner of the World Wide Web, as simple or as wild as you want it to be. That's why netnet is here, to help you unlock all the creative potential of this meta-media commons. So instead of producing content for corporate algorithms, I invite you to join me in creating handcrafted internet art and culture for ourselves and each other. And on that note, feel free to click the X on this video to quit this tutorial and jump straight into sketching, or continue exploring some of the other lessons by clicking on netnet's face and exploring the learning guide.